Hi. So I've been looking at modern Edison format, and I've been playing modern Edison format for a long period of time. And I wanted to make a video talking about this card, Legacy of Yata-Garasu, because I think it's honestly probably the most interesting Edison meta development, and to an extent, I think for Goat as well with Jar of Greed. And I want to talk about this card in why people are playing it. So, obviously, what does this card do? It's a very simple card. It has two effects. It has one effect that lets you draw one card, and then it has a super secret effect that almost never comes up that allows you to draw two cards. And, occasionally it'll come up with, like, Dark Dust Spirit, Azura Priest. There are a couple of spirit monsters that people play in this format, but 99 times out of 100, that's not the reason people are playing this card. And so, a little bit of background on this card was that in 2010, nobody played this card. Absolutely nobody played it outside of a deck that is designed to take advantage of it, which is something like Chainburn. If you go and you look at the historical YCS Edison, New Jersey, out of the top 16 decks at that tournament, 0 copies of this card were played. And a lot of people back in the day, they looked at this card, they said, this card does literally nothing. This card is too slow to deck thin. Why would I do that? I could play Upstart Goblin. People didn't play Upstart Goblin either, I think because they thought the life point cost was too high. People weren't playing decks like Dragon Turbo where they really had to draw into your cards and get that consistency. But in the revival of Edison format, people have really started to see this card's potential, and over time, it has steadily seen increased play in a variety of different decks. But why? What does this card do that makes it so special, and why are people playing it? And I think the best way to demonstrate why this card is good is to give an example. So, let's say you're playing Blackwings, and this looks like a pretty standard Blackwing hand. It's an okay hand. Yeah, you didn't draw your Black Whirlwind, but this hand is certainly playable. But you have a dilemma with this hand. Most people are going to normal summon Shura turn 1. Maybe there's an argument for Bora turn 1, but the question is, what spell and traps do you set here? You've got Bottomless Trap Hole, you've got Icarus, you're probably not setting Brain Control. And this is where the problem comes. See these two cards on the right? You've got Heavy Storm and MST. And in this hand, you have no good solutions to either of those cards. Let's say you go scenario 1 and you set both back row. You normal summon Shura, you set both back row. If your opponent plays Heavy Storm, you're losing this game 9 times out of 10. You're already down one card, you have nothing to protect your Shura, it's probably going to get run over by something and you're going to lose. Because you have a little bit of follow-up, you've got Blizzard, yeah, you've got Brain Control, but you're at a huge disadvantage. And in most hands where you're going to make a play like this, you're probably losing. Alternatively, if you summon Shura and you set one back row, and this is all assuming you're going first, you're probably in a losing position to a blind MST. Probably 6-7 times out of 10. And you're probably losing that game. It's not guaranteed. You obviously can fight back. It's a 1-for-1 trade, but your Shura is probably going to go, and you don't have that Kalut insurance in your hand. But what if you didn't lose to either of these cards? And in fact, what if in the process of playing these cards, it puts you in a winning position? And this is going to go to key point number 1. Legacy of Yata-Garasu is Heavy Storm insurance without being a brick. And what I mean by that, and I will show the example as to why, most people think, oh, if I want to protect or, protect myself against Heavy Storm, I can play something like, Starlight Road. Yeah, people will play, Solemn Judgment as well, but, you don't want to pay half your life points to stop a +1 off Heavy Storm. You're probably going to do it, but it's not a play that you want to make. And Starlight Road is a powerful card, but there's a lot of games where, a player draws Starlight Road, never have a situation to trigger it, and you're just playing the entire game down a card. And that will lose you a lot of games in this format. And legacy is never a brick in that scenario. So here's the example, and most people probably can conceptualize this pretty easily. Let's say you go first, and you're the turn player right here. And I don't care what your monster is, that doesn't matter for this example. But let's say you go and you set 2 back row. You set your real back row, and then you set your Legacy of Yata-Garasu. Well, your opponent draws Heavy Storm, and they have no Starlight Road Fear, and they've dropped their Heavy Storm turn 1. Well, normally that would be a +1 for them. You'd go 2 for 1. And in this case, yes, you're going -1 because 2 of your cards are being destroyed. They're losing a card. But then you chain your Legacy of Yata-Garasu, which replaces Legacy itself. So their Heavy Storm, which they thought was going to be a +1, now ends up being a 1-for-1 trade. And now you also play the rest of the game with the knowledge that they don't have Heavy Storm. So you can kind of set your entire back row without, too much hesitation. Yeah, they might black rose it, but if you have cards to stop that, it's not gonna be a big deal. So that information that you get from them playing that gives you a pretty big advantage for the rest of the game. Now they've also wasted their Heavy Storm, and they didn't even get any advantage out of it. You're still losing a tempo because that Shura that you may have summoned is now doesn't have any defense, but in my opinion, this is a much more recoverable game. And this leads me to key point number 2, which has to do with the MST example. Legacy of Yata-Garasu is the ultimate bait card. Let's say you go first and you do the same thing. You set 2 back row, and your opponent blind MSTs your Legacy. Well, they probably just lost the game because you're going to chain Legacy. You're gonna basically go net 0 on card advantage. They're going to -1 themselves with their MST, and now you're going to be drawing to 2 cards ahead of them if you're going first. And in this format, that is a losing disadvantage with most decks. And I showed you the MST example. Let's say they have a Lila. They switch Lila to defense, pop your Legacy. You chain Legacy. They lose a lot of tempo by switching their Lila to defense. Let's say they flip summon a Raikou, and they pop your back row, which is not the worst play. A lot of people will do that. You chain Legacy. It is a bait card. It baits out your opponent's disruption, your opponent's removal, and then you plus off of it. And it's so good at doing that. It's so good at doing that. Your opponent's going to think, I'm going to get more advantage out of this Black Rose Dragon because I pop your Legacy. And then you chain Legacy, and now what they thought was a +1, they go hand neutral, and they've got an open board. And key point number 3, I said Legacy of Yata-Garasu is the ultimate bait card. Legacy of Yata-Garasu is the ultimate bait card. I got a couple of examples right here of some more advanced use cases or niche use cases of Legacy of Yata. Right here, let's say you have summoned a Tragodia, and your opponent's going to attack you directly with Stardust, and you've got 4 cards in hand. But you set Legacy of Yata-Garasu. Well, they go into attack declaration, they attack, you go to battle step, and in battle step, you flip Legacy of Yata-Garasu. Well, now your Tragodia, which was 2,400, goes to 3,000. They ran their Stardust into your Tragodia, it dies, and then they probably lose the game because their resources they put into Stardust go to waste. Now, and you've just gotten a +1 from your Tragodia, and that's just a completely winning position. Another scenario, similar one, but this time with Gores. Let's say you've got an open board, your Stardust attacks you directly, you've got 1 set back row, you flip your Legacy of Yata-Garasu, you draw your card. Hey, now I've got an empty board. This Gore's in my hand. I'm just going to drop this Gore's now. I've got a 2,700 Gore's. I've got a defense position, 2,500 token. I'm going to kill your Stardust next turn. And I'm probably winning the game now. And so those are just some niche examples. But, if you're setting 2 back row, it makes players uneasy. They're going to be thinking to themselves, okay, he's got 2 back row. Does he have Mirror Force? Does he have Torrential Tribute? Does he have the random Book of Moon to stop me from killing him? Then are they going to kill me on the run back? It forces your opponent to question the plays that they're trying to make. And because of that, even though you don't have real back row, they're probably going to respect it and play more defensively. And when they didn't necessarily have to. And so that gives you more turns to try to hit them on the run back. And that puts you in a much better position overall. So those are the first 3 key points. Key point number 4. and this is going to get a little bit more complicated. Legacy of Yata-Garasu buffers your garnets. And so, again, this is a bit complicated to explain, but I'm going to show this with an example. Let's say that you put Legacy of Yata-Garasu in a Diva Hero deck. Well, most Diva Hero decks, not all of them, but most of them are going to play Gilman. And so let's say that you play 41 cards, and you just add a copy of Legacy of Yata-Garasu. And it just so happens that the Legacy of Yata was the 6th card you drew in your hand. So you draw your 4 cards, your 5th card was Deep Sea Diva, and then your 6th card was Legacy of Yata-Garasu. But the 7th card in your deck was Gilman. In this case, you drew a Legacy of Yata-Garasu instead of your brick. So now you can do your Diva, get your Gilman, go for your Catastrophe or Android, whatever play you want to do there. And this situation is very, very good. Because you played Legacy of Yata-Garasu, you were able to summon Gilman from your deck, and now you can't draw that brick later on in the game, and it also made your Diva much better. So in this case, Legacy of Yata-Garasu acted as a buffer card to buffer you from drawing Gilman. In the alternative situation, where Legacy wasn't in your deck, and you were playing 4 cards, the next card in your deck would have been Spine Gilman. So here, you drew your Gilman in this situation, and it's not ideal. Now, there's also the worst case scenario, which is where your Legacy of Yata blocks you from getting to your combo starter, in this case Diva. So in this case, let's say if Legacy of Yata wasn't in the deck, then you would have drawn your 4 cards, your Gilman, and then your Diva. But in this case, because you drew Legacy of Yata, the next card in your deck would have been Diva. So this is the bad situation where, okay, now you don't get to your combo starter. But compared to this, where you do get to your combo starter, this situation isn't as bad. You're still going to draw your Diva next turn. That's not that big of a deal. You would have otherwise pseudo-bricked yourself because you would have drawn Gilman and you would have drawn Diva. So your Diva still wouldn't have had that value. You keep all the bait potential with Legacy of Yata that I talked about earlier. And so, yes, this is a bad scenario, but it's less bad than this situation. This situation is much better than the advantage you lose from that situation. That's kind of the concept with buffer cards here. That's why, people might play a buffer card in a deck that has more than 40 cards. Pretty uncommon, but some people do that. So, I talked about this case of you drawing your garnets. Here's a few other situations where this might come up. Let's say, you might buffer Malicious by drawing Stratos or drawing Emergency Call or something like that, or, Rhoda. You can buffer a Machina Fortress instead of drawing it, because Fortress is really a card you want to search off of Gear Frame, or a card that you want to mill off of a Raikou or something like that. You can buffer Gajiltron Dragon if you're playing a Gear Town engine, because Gajiltron's typically not a card you want to draw. It's not terrible in some situations, especially if you run like a Machina engine, but it's really a card that you want to draw off of Gear Town as opposed to hard summoning it or something like that. You can buffer gadgets. You never want to draw multiple copies of a gadget, 99% of the time. If you have a Legacy of Yata-Garasu, it can buffer you from drawing multiple gadgets. And just as another example, it can buffer drawing multiple volcanic shells. If you're playing a quick draw engine, you really only want to draw one volcanic shell, pitch it for quick draw, put it in the graveyard, and then start looping them to get your drill warriors. And so, key point number 5, easier side decking. If you're going to go and you're going to side deck, this is the easiest card in the entire game to side out of, because it is strictly not necessary for any engine other than like Chainburn. Cutting this card is not going to dilute your deck, it's not going to hurt your ratios, and it's not going to hurt your engine. A big issue I think that a lot of players struggle with is they make their side deck, and then they go into this matchup and they've got all these side deck cards, and then they sit there and they're like, what do I side out of? And then they start cutting into their engine core cards. And yes, they do that, and they start countering their opponent's deck, but they lose so much consistency from their own deck that the deck then loses to itself. And I see this a lot. So if you start your game with Legacy of Yata-Garasu's in your deck, you can just cut this card. Just take out your 2 copies, put in your 2 Pulling the Rugs, put in your 2 Dust Tornadoes or 2 Cyber Dragons. It makes your side decking brainless. It's so easy with this card. And then finally, and this is key point number 6, and this is the most obvious one, is deck thinning. I play Legacy Yata-Garasu. It replaces itself. It's slow, but I'm thinning my deck. So yeah, I'm going to see my Black Whirlwind. Hypothetically, if I'm playing Diva Heroes, I'll see Future Fusion. I'm going to see my Brain Control. I'm going to see Heavy Storm. I'm going to see Dark Arm Dragon. I'm going to see it more often and in more games. So to summarize these key points, you've got your Heavy Storm Insurance, your Ultimate Bait card, the Ultimate Bait card, buffer your Garnets, easier side decking, and deck thinning. And so these are a lot of pros. And so, why didn't people play this card a long time ago? Why hasn't people always played this card? Well, obviously there are downsides to this card. And the major downside, and the downside that everybody thought about and thought this was a huge deal, was that you lose tempo and you slow down your deck. And because Legacy of Yata-Garasu doesn't do anything other than replace itself a turn later, you're seeing less cards that are live and do things now. And that's a very important thing. If you're only seeing 5 cards, you have less options as to how you want to play your hand. I know that this is a temporary disadvantage, but if you miss out on a card like Bottomless Trap Hole, you miss out on a card like Mirror Force, and your opponent's able to run over your Shura, then now you've lost a card because the Legacy of Yata that would have been your defensive card is no longer there. So playing the game temporarily a card down is a big deal. Your turn 1 might be, let's say I'm going second and I go and I set 2 and pass. That's really bad because I now have no board presence. If I don't have a real back row, or they destroy my real back row with some sort of combo or whatever they want to do, then I'm going to lose a lot of life points. I'm going to lose like half my life points, possibly even more than that. In that situation now, I'm forced to make a board presence, because if I don't, I can just die. And so I have to play more aggro, I have to commit more to the board, and then I can get more easily blown out by a card like Bottomless, Torrential, things like that. Coinciding with that, it's almost always a bad top deck in the late game. Let's say you're playing against Black Wings and you happen to draw, you're both on top decks, you draw Legacy of Yata-Garasu. Well, you're going to set that, and then they're going to summon Shura, and you're going to take 1800 to the face and probably lose the game. That card could have been a Dimensional Prison. It could have been a Bottomless Trap Hole. It could have been a more defensive card. So it's bad in that situation. And the second reason that it's bad is because of this card. Obviously, if you play Legacy of Yata-Garasu, your deck has more traps. You're going to become more susceptible to Royal Decree. I think that this card straight up can win a bunch of games against certain decks, and if your deck can play it, it can be really, really oppressive. And truth be told, that's really all the downsides of this card. You've got a lot of pros here. You've got your Heavy Storm Insurance, Ultimate Bait card, etc. And really your big con is your tempo loss and your deck slowdown. Now, of course, you might say, oh, well, I've got 6 pros and 2 cons, so obviously every deck should play Legacy of Yata. Well, no, because this is a big con. A lot of these are small cons or a little bit more niche. So you have to weigh, okay, well, this might have a weight of 6 normal pros or 5 normal pros, and then you have to weight all of these and determine, is this card worth playing? And a lot of times these pros and cons also depend on the deck you're playing and what your deck's trying to accomplish. And so if you look at a lot of the decks that have been playing Legacy of Yata-Garasu, a very common deck that plays it is Black Wings. And if you look at the pros and you look at the cons with Black Wings, it starts to make a lot of sense why people play this. Black Wings are a deck that wants to deck thin because they want to get to Black Whirlwind. They're a deck that does play a pretty good amount of back row, and they want to have that Heavy Storm Insurance They want to have that ability to bait out other spell and trap removal. And it's not really a deck that wants to play Starlight Road because it's a brick. And you're not going to play decks that are going to trigger Starlight Road. But you still want that insurance, and playing Starlight Road just for Heavy Storm isn't enough justification for it. They're a deck that plays a very grindy game, so they're a deck that doesn't care about losing a little bit of tempo from playing this card. They're a deck that maybe wants to buffer drawing their values. It might be a situation where you summon Shura, you attack, you destroy something, trigger Shura, and you summon a value from the deck. If you buffer your value that you would have drawn in your hand, well, now you can't draw that value, or you can't get that value from your Shura. Most people are going to play 2 values in Blackwings. That's becoming more and more common. But this still applies because, if you buffer one value, once you summon it off Shura, you're less likely to draw the other one. And there's also, in the Blackwing deck, you really don't want to side out of a lot of your monsters. Maybe you can side out of Bora, maybe you can side out of Sirocco. If you play 3 Blizzard, maybe you can side out of 1 Blizzard, maybe you can side out of 1 value. But if you cut too many Blackwings, you're going to really start eating into your engine. You're going to start losing that consistency with your deck. So if you play a card like Legacy of Yata, very easy card to side deck out into, again, like you're pulling the rug, stuff like that. As a counterexample, with a deck like Lightsworn, almost none of these pros matter. Yes, it's a deck that wants to get to Judgment Dragon, but it wants to get to JD by milling cards and then probably playing Beckoning Light or Monster Reincarnation. It has plenty of ways to get to JD. The big thing about Lightsworn is it wants to mill its deck. It's a deck that plays almost no back row, so there's really not a whole lot of baiting potential. You're really not insuring yourself against Heavy Storm with this deck. Playing this card, the tempo loss with this card is going to hurt you trying to get to JD. It's a deck that wants to draw its solar recharges, and maybe an argument could be made that this card could buffer Wolf, but I really don't see that as a reason you'd want to justify that. And lastly, Lightsworns, in my opinion, as long as you have your critical mass of different Lightsworn monsters, it's an easier deck to go inside out of, let's say, a Raikou, or let's say an Aaron, or let's say like a Jane or something like that. The cards are much more flexible in a Lightsworn deck as to what you want to side out of, as long as you've got that critical mass. So in this deck, in Lightsworns, it's just not a good card to play, and it doesn't make sense. And what a lot of people, what you want to do, especially like when you're trying to get better at this format, is that this is the type of critical thinking that you want to do when you're evaluating, do I want to play this card? It's one thing to go and net deck a deck and say, oh, well, this top 8 deck was playing this card. But you want to understand the why. Why are they playing this card? Why aren't they playing this card? You don't want to just fall onto a fad of playing a certain card unless you really understand the ins and out of why the card is good and why it works with certain decks. So with that said, there's also, a couple of niche use cases for Legacy of Yata-Garasu. Obviously, Chainburn is an obvious example of a deck that you'd want to play it in. There's also the Winged Rhinos deck, which I'm actually a huge fan of. I really like this deck. It's obviously a very, very good card in there, because then you can chain your Winged Rhinos, so you can start getting chains to get accumulated fortune, or to protect your Rhinos from some sort of destruction. Obviously, you've got the secret second effect to let you draw 2 cards, which does occasionally come up. It's a pretty good card in Kuraz. Since Kuraz can target Legacy of Yata, you can chain your Legacy and you can get a +1 off of that, so it's a pretty good card. And then in a lot of these newer decks that are playing Tethys, you can play Legacy of Yata-Garasu and try to gain some advantage by drawing fairy monsters with Tethys. So it's a pretty good card in there. So overall, those are really the reasons why this card has started to see play. And players, over the years have started to understand a lot of these concepts with the pros and realized these make it worth playing. And that's really what we've seen as people have explored this format, and people have also learned from formats like GOAT format, where a lot of these concepts are also there. So just wanted to talk about this, and yeah,